The breath, like self-inquiry, is an extremely efficacious practice of recognizing the nature of the mind and increasing one's self-awareness. Self-inquiry is, of course, analytical, delving into the question, who am I, using reasoning and analysis to break up errors in thought patterns that are deeply embedded in our consciousness. The substantiality of the world, the permanence of objects, ourself as instantiations, discrete instantiations of consciousness, separate from all other beings. And so forth. That self-inquiry's task is to break apart those kind of deeply embedded notions of selfhood and others. If you have a view of self, of course, you're going to have a view of others. And that leads to all sorts of ontological problems for developing a correct worldview. So self-inquiry is the most powerful of the mind training techniques for breaking up these kind of vasanas, they're called, impressions. And within the Buddhist tradition, Nagarjuna, of course, was the greatest exponent of self-inquiry. He is known as the king of reasoning for a reason, no pun intended. Contrasting on the other end of the spectrum, and equally as efficacious, is the practice of breath mastery, or pranayama. Now, there are many different iterations of this practice. The most basic was popularized by Goenka, but it existed long before Goenka, who is a contemporary teacher and a very phenomenal one who helped millions of people. Probably as many people as Iyengar helped through introducing Hatha Yoga to the West. So Goenka was no doubt one of the greatest teachers of our time as far as the influence he had on others. He taught mindfulness of breathing. He taught it because it's the easiest practice to teach to a mass audience. Some might even say that the teachings of Christ can be similarly compared, because Christ's teachings, although Christ was an incredible yogi, capable of teaching very deep forms of meditation, chose to teach morality, kindness, compassion, generosity, and help people to develop a firm foundation in just being a good human being. Similarly, mindfulness practice has been taught in the West because it's suitable for very large audiences. You cannot go wrong with mindfulness practice. Watching the breath go in and watching the breath go out. One can get into very deep states of mind and meditation with these practices. of mindfulness of breath. Pranayama practice is for a much narrower audience. It was developed by great yogis and rishis for those who have already practiced and are familiar with the movement of the breath as in mindfulness practice. At some point in mindfulness practice, mindfulness of breathing practice, we come to the awareness that through regulation of the breath, one can go far deeper and be far more mindful of the breath than passively watching it. This can be compared with moving from samatha meditation or quiescent meditation to insight meditation. All forms of meditation can introduce calm and quiet. At some point we become absorbed in this calm and quiet and very peaceful. And that's when we want to introduce insight meditation and ask ourselves, who is quiet? And that's where analytical meditation steps in and disrupts this whole quiet, peaceful state of mind in a very productive way that cuts through ignorance and attachment to quiescent states. So the blending of quiescent meditation and insight meditation is what develops wisdom. Getting back to pranayama now, regulation of breath rather than mindfulness of breath has been developed in a very scientific way to help people become aware of more subtle aspects of the breath through introducing a kind of insight to the breath through regulating it. In other words, disturbing the status quo of calm and relaxed mindfulness of the breath and introducing regulating of the breath, which demands much more attention mentally and physically. So the question sometimes arises, well, if this is so, why is mindfulness of the breath taught by so many great masters throughout the world, Goenka included? The reason is very simple. They're teaching to a very, very, very broad audience, and most of that audience wouldn't be suitable. Pranayama would not be suitable for much of that audience, where mindfulness of the breath is suitable. And somewhere along the line, if one is practicing mindfulness of breath, whether one has a teacher that teaches otherwise or not, one's going to become aware automatically of the power of regulation of breath. So there are many ways to regulate the breath. And from my own experience, which started out from a no experience whatsoever and practicing simple mindfulness of the breath, introducing it into my meditation practice, I discovered myself that regulation of breath was more powerful. Then I studied Iyengar's book, Pranayama, Light on Pranayama, which has dozens of variations of regulation of the breath. For example, like 10 seconds inhale, 10 seconds retention on the top after the inhalation, 10-second exhale, and 10 seconds retention after the exhale, which is called sama pranayama, because the ratio are even on each one. But just as an exercise, and for a period of about 8 months, I went through all of them, and these included bizarre ratios, like inhalation 10 times as long as the retention at the top, and then the exhalation a fourth time of the inhalation, and then retention after the exhalation a fraction of the time of the retention after the inhalation, and literally dozens of ratios. But for myself, for experts, that path is pranayama. Knowing all of these is very, it can be a path of pranayama. And this path has been around a long time, predating the Buddha by a couple of thousand years. And this has all been figured out a long, long time ago. The power of the regulation of the breath. So if one wants to choose regulating of the breath as a path, it will behoove one to try the different ratios that are known in the circles of pranayama, and find one that resonates with you, that works for you. Myself, from a meditation background and not interested in pranayama per se as the main emphasis of my path, find sama pranayama the best for myself, which is just beginning with the retention, then an inhalation for the same length of time as the retention, again a retention after the inhalation, then an exhalation, all the same number of seconds. Now, I've been able to progress a long way on this practice. It's much more effective than merely watching the breath. Much, 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 much more effective. In that it's more capable of controlling, or I don't like to use the word control, dissolving the wandering mind into the breath. So when we regulate the breath, it's far more effective for dissolving thoughts, desires, emotions, and everything else into the breath. But it's also far, far more difficult of a practice. Myself, I do 1 hour a day. That's it. I can't do anymore. It's very, very, very demanding to do, physically demanding. And also I found out the hard way through doing this practice in ice water in the mountains, that it can be dangerous. So if we are smart about it, we will do the regulation correctly, within our limits, without stuttering or forcing ourselves in any way. In other words, no gasping for breath or anything, but still barely being able to make it through the cycle. In other words, it should feel very, very difficult for whatever period of time you can do it. Most people cannot do it for an hour, and I don't suggest that anyone does it for an hour. I do it for an hour because I've been practicing it for a while, and I came from a meditation background, practicing Chan meditation and also self-inquiry. So when I started, I already was able to, do breath cycles that were much, much more advanced in a beginner stage, right from the very first day I tried. When some of the helpful things that I have found that I really like is to use a metronome. A metronome, most musicians know, many lay people too, it just keeps a beat, and you can set it to anything you want. You can set it to 30 beats a minute, once every 2 seconds. You can set it to every 5 seconds, whatever you like. And this brings me to an important point. One of the nice things about a metronome is that you can find what's right for you more quickly, what ratios are right. I always suggest starting with sama pranayama, which is the even breath, and just counting using a metronome to count the time of the retention, the inhalation, and retention at the top, and exhalation. They count the amount of time until you find your mean, what's not too easy and not too difficult. Once that is found, just start a practice. Introduce it into whatever practice you consider your main practice. For myself, it forms about one third of my main practice, or less than that, because it is strenuous physically. But it can be introduced into a Chan practice, or a visualization practice, a mantra recitation practice. It can be part of a broader based practice, and should be. So if we understand that when we practice mindfulness of breathing, like any other practice, the practice is to dissolve into the practice, so you don't even know you're practicing. Of course, if there are coarse thoughts going on, what you're going to do later on in the day, or what you're going to do once you get off from your meditation cushion, or what color you're going to paint your room, or aches and pains in the body, or even if a mosquito on your nose. If you're noticing these things, you're not really absorbed very much into the meditation. You're certainly not dissolving into it. And the idea is to use the practice of regulation of breath to dissolve into the breath completely. So all thoughts dissolve into the breath. If you try and do that merely watching the breath, you don't have to ask anyone. You can observe yourself that as you're watching the breath, other thoughts are present. The reason is because the breath that we're watching isn't watched very well, and we're not dissolving into it. Although it's more difficult to dissolve into regulation of the breath, it's a very difficult practice. It's easier to dissolve into it than it would be merely watching the breath. So watching the breath is a really good stepping stone to pranayama practice. But it's easy to get stuck there because it's so easy. The practice itself is easy. It's very blissful and peaceful and happy, but it won't lead to insight meditation, not in 100 million years. But regulation of the breath will, and that's why the rishis that developed it, they were well aware of watching the breath, mindfulness of the breath. It came out of there as a necessity to develop insight meditation. Insight, which is the wisdom aspect that integrates with the calm aspect, the peaceful aspect. The active aspect that integrates itself, balances out the passive aspect of meditation. So, the point of this discussion here is just to bring up what I found very, very helpful in my own practice as one who practiced watching the breath for years as part of my practice, and then decided to go deeper through regulation of the breath. And there's absolutely no comparison. So, for what it's worth, that's all I have to say about it for now. And I hope people use the practice of the breath, because it's always available. In some form or other, use the practice of breath in whatever meditation discipline one chooses to practice. And that's all I have to say on this topic. Enjoy your breath.